Welcome to everybody here who's joining us. My name is Paul Roberts, and I'm the founder of Secure Resilient Future Foundation. I'm really excited to have everybody here for this webinar, which is Tech Timebombs, Fixing the Cyber Risk of EOL, or End-of-Life Hardware. This is a big and growing issue, and we've got some amazing people here to talk about some of the grassroots efforts that are going on to address this issue. Some housekeeping to begin with. We are going to be recording this, as you probably just heard, and it will be available after the fact for you to watch. We're using Zoom webinars here to host this, and Zoom has a really nice Q&A feature. So if you've got questions, please take advantage of the Q&A feature, post them there, and we will get to them. There is a chat feature as well, so you can chat with some of the panelists here or other members in the audience. And here is our agenda. We're going to just talk a little bit about this organization Chris and I created called Secure Resilient Future Foundation with a bunch of other folks from the sort of consumer rights and cybersecurity communities. And then we're going to dig into the end-of-life problem. Stacey Higginbotham's here from Consumer Reports, done a lot of really interesting work on that. And we're going to talk about the various dimensions of the end-of-life problem, from cybersecurity through consumer rights. We're going to talk about some model legislation we all put together to address this issue and what that could do if adopted, and how we're going to go try and get it adopted. And then at the end, we're going to talk about how to manage the end-of-life problem in your home, in your personal life, in your business environment, both as a software producer and a consumer, and leave you with some good tips just for managing this absent laws to protect you. Okay. My amazing panel, thank you so much for being here. First is Chris Wysopal, who is the Chief Security Evangelist and co-founder of Veracode. Chris, welcome.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. I'm on the board of Secure Resilient Future Foundation. My day job is at Veracode, and I was a vulnerability researcher back in the 90s, finding problems with things at the Loft. And one of the things we did at the Loft was we didn't just look at software, we actually started looking at hardware. So I think we were on the forefront of innovating there. And one of the things we played with was there was a Barney doll that would speak to you. And we reprogrammed it just to show that these devices can be tampered with and played with. And obviously today, there's so much more complex and connected to the internet. And we're going to get into why that's a problem.
That's Barney the dinosaur, for those of you.
Barney the dinosaur, yes. We made Barney the dinosaur say something he probably shouldn't have said.
All right. Our other panelist, Stacey Higginbotham. Stacey is a policy advocate at Consumer Reports, longtime tech journalist, and ran a blog for a long time, Stacey on IoT. So expert in Internet of Things technologies. And one of the folks who's really done probably more than anyone to call attention to some of the questionable practices of IoT device makers, including end-of-life stuff. Stacey, welcome.
Thank you. And yes, I like to tell people that my house was the living lab for a decade while I did all of this. And I can tell you that I actually had, I think it was 2015, I hired someone to hack my house, and they were lovely. They came in, they did a man in the middle of attack for my Wi-Fi, and it didn't go so well. My Wi-Fi password was amazing. I'm just going to throw that out there. But then I gave them access, and then they ended up being able to access a ton of fun stuff like door locks and outlets and my blender. And so that was fun. And I'm excited to come here today to talk about, it's 10 years now since that happened, and many of the issues are the same. So we'll talk about it.
And Stacey, you've got something like 5 dozen smart devices in your home. Is that right? You have a large number of smart stuff.
I used to have 120. Now I'm down to about, I think, between 40 and 50. I should actually know the exact number. Are we just counting Bluetooth or just Wi-Fi?
Does anyone really know the exact number?
Yeah.
It's the challenge, right? Wait till you have a teenager and they can buy stuff on Temu and come and plug it into your network.
That's like,
I just wanted to scare everybody out there.
It's like, Who gives their teenager their actual Wi-Fi password and doesn't have a separate guest network for?
And Chris, as you would point out, IT asset inventory is a problem not just in homes, but in businesses as well, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
if you don't know what you have, how can you protect it? There's this idea that, oh, we just put a wall around everything and it's protected. And then you forget actually each one of these devices has to communicate in and out of that firewall to the internet or it doesn't work. So yeah, it's a challenge.
I'm Paul Roberts. I co-founded SRFF with Chris and a bunch of other great people. So our website is www.secure-resilient.org. We're a 501c4 nonprofit created earlier in 2024, really with the goal of promoting smart cyber policies, I think is probably the simplest way to put it. There's been a dearth of those. Background is, again, as a cybersecurity journalist, I created my own publication, Security Ledger, back in 2012. It was very into and focused on IoT stuff. And honestly, the end of life thing came into my head because I did a IoT and security event called Security of Things for a few years. And the first year I did it, my keynote speaker was Dan Gear. And Dan's his keynote speech was about end of life as a issue. And this was 2014. So early days of the IoT, but Dan's on the board of SRFF as well, already looking ahead and saying, this is going to be a real problem when these devices die. What is going to happen to them? Because they're going to pose a huge risk. 9 years later, or 10 years later, we have SRFF, Secure Resilient Future Foundation. And it is basically a nonprofit group created to give cybersecurity experts, Chris, Dan, and the community as a whole, a seat at the policy table. And that's why it's a C4 instead of a C3. C4, you can actually go out and propose policy ideas, advocate for them, and so on. And we're fighting to improve and nurture the cybersecurity, resilience, and sustainability of smart connected stuff. So our focus is on software-driven stuff. But as Chris pointed out, that's everything these days. But really promoting good practices with those. Here's the roadmap on how you do that. First is challenge the status quo within big tech, which is really around time to market, features and functionality, and security is a low priority. There isn't really much disincentive to ignore security. And promoting resilience and sustainability. So I've done a lot of work in the last few years in the right to repair movement. And that got my thinking really about the benefit of having things that are long-lived and secure and manageable, and what types of abilities you need to have as a smart device to be sustainable. And then getting really smart folks like Chris, Tara Wheeler, Dan Gear, and others to get behind policies and really go and talk to both lawmakers and their staff and to the public and get people educated around why we need this and what we need. So this is I think SRFF grew out of the idea of right to repair. We've had a lot of success. We passed electronic right to repair laws in 5 states, but there's a bigger conversation, and actually end of life devices really speak to that bigger issue, which is even if you have a right to repair, there are still other things that might be impediments to you to have a secure device ecosystem, to have long-lived devices, and so on. And so this slide lays out some expressions of that end of life problem. Medical devices. So there have been a whole bunch of medical devices that have end of life. A really classic example is a Fisker Ocean electric vehicle, introduced, sold for $75,000 a piece. And then really within months, the company itself imploded. And there was this prospect that they would be taking their cloud servers offline and really not exactly bricking their cars, but pretty close, taking away a lot of the features and functionality that people paid for, and really raising big questions about the sustainability of those automobiles. That didn't happen in part because the Fisker owners got together and battled for their rights as owners, which is really interesting. And then, as we're going to talk about, consumer tech like broadband home routers. We've seen them abandoned by their manufacturers, often without much attention or notice, and then compromised by sophisticated cyber actors. And we're going to talk about that later. So those are some of the things that have happened to bring this end of life problem to the fore. Okay. So I guess Stacey, actually, I want to start with you. This is so end of life problems are not new. This is something that you've observed in the consumer space for a consumer IoT space for a really long time. And I guess, why is it, why has it become a problem or a chronic phenomena with smart software driven devices? So,
Sure, I did it. I was the first one. Okay, so what we have with any sort of connected device, it's built on software. And we've all heard the Andreessen software is eating the world. The problem with software is software degrades constantly over time. And it degrades in a couple different ways, right? You've got your S for the underlying device, you've got vulnerabilities that might come in, you've got all of these things that constantly need to be maintained.
mm,
A lot of the companies who are building these connected devices, they're used to building physical products that degrade in ways that are like researched. You know how long maybe you don't know how long something's going to be soldered to a board, but you have a pretty good indication. Or if you're a vacuum cleaner maker, you know how long a gasket's going to last. You have research on that. When you add software to that, you have the physical like degradation, which is pretty slow and known. And then you have the software degradation, which is fast and unknown. And so what happens is these companies, they don't allocate the budget or the resources to maintain that. A lot of the IoT devices, when they started coming out, and even still today, companies that are surprised by the ongoing nature of their cloud costs, they're not building that into the cost
right.
of the device. So they're like, we have this idea, it's called a digital bomb. And this is where a company that's building a connected device, you've got your physical bill of materials. Now you need this digital one. And that can include things like your cloud and ongoing maintenance costs, right? It also includes your cybersecurity research, right? Like that. And it includes engineers or developers for every OS update. So those are some things that will include. The challenge is these companies are putting this stuff out there. They may have an inkling, but they're not thinking, oh, I'm going to support this over 5 years. And for those 5 years, I'm going to allocate this much money to it. And thus, I need to price my product right up here. Instead, they're thinking, I'm selling a vacuum. I've always sold vacuums. This is connected, so I'll add like $20. And then none of that other stuff is happening. So what happens is
It's all about the
when,
features and the functionality, right?
yeah. And so then these things, either there's a couple ways this happens. One, your product might fail, right? You might only sell like 100 of them, but those 100 still have those costs. So then they're going to try to shut it down, or maybe they'll just abandon it without telling anybody. And then because that software degrades and because vulnerabilities might happen, it becomes a weak point in your network, or maybe you just like it stops working as well. There's
Right.
also the issue of if it's super successful, maybe you want to support it for a while and then you get your next version out and then you're like, oh, I hated using that cloud or I hated using that software library. I'm going to switch it, but then you can't support it. So then you're going to take it offline. But consumers who purchase these things don't necessarily understand, one, that they're going to degrade more rapidly than physical stuff, two, that they require updates, and three, that their product working over time is at the whim of the manufacturer. So that's really just the connected device problem. So end of life problem is like when the manufacturers are done with this, we're breaking it off. And then they take it and they stop providing security updates, or maybe they just stop supporting or providing firmware updates. And then what happens is maybe you get a vulnerability. Maybe it's just the next version of the OS for the app. Things start to break. So that's the issue.
Yeah. And as you pointed out, often that decision and that boundary that you cross between this is a supported, patched, updatable product and one that we are no longer supporting, updating, patching happens without the awareness of the device owner, right? And there isn't really, and as many people have pointed out to me, when you buy electronics, it's not like you necessarily establish a relationship with the manufacturer, right? You buy it, you install it in your home. The manufacturer doesn't really know who you are, and you're not really engaging that much with them. But that is an issue here, which is as a device owner, you may not know or be informed when that device has ceased support, right?
You absolutely are not informed. Like, it is
Right.
a rare instance that you are informed. And when you are informed, it's usually something you have to go looking for. So I,
Right.
as a consumer, and we'll talk about it in like the action items later, but just broadly, consumer reports, we looked at appliances. We looked at, because the average consumer thinks that their appliance should last 10 years. So we went through all 21 major appliance brands, and only 3 of them actually gave any sort of indication of how long they were going to support their software. It was GE and their affiliates. And they basically said, hey, we're going to support it for 5 years or 5 years after the launch of this. So that if you're a consumer, you're like, when did it launch? I don't know. Is mine still
Yeah.
supported? You had to read the terms and conditions to get that. And
Right.
other research shows that, like, the FTC did a report. They looked at 184 smart devices and found that they could only find information on they couldn't find information on 89% of those devices. Yeah, we'll talk about it in a minute,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's hard.
So one of the problems is that this is, as you said, clearly a consumer issue and a consumer rights issue. But the other problem here, and this is something that we're seeking to address as SERF and also just as consumer advocates, is that these end of life devices pose a significant cyber risk to everybody, to homes, to businesses, to our economy, to critical infrastructure. And Chris, we've seen a lot of interesting work done around this. I think about Lumen's Black Lotus Labs, but you've talked about it as well. What is the issue with end of life devices when it comes to cybersecurity?
I'm going to go off mute this time. Okay. So the challenge is, as soon Stacey mentioned earlier, like software ages like milk. Software over time, new vulnerability categories are discovered, new attack techniques are discovered, new vulnerabilities are discovered in the software that was shipped to the consumer, both the code that the manufacturer wrote and the code that maybe came in open source and was part of an assembly process where they put a lot of open source together to make the product with maybe some glue and UI. All aspects of that software over time, vulnerabilities are going to be discovered. And as soon as they're discovered and made public, that makes it trivial, really, for someone to say, hey, I'm going to go target this type of device, because in the vulnerability report, it says the type of device, the patch level, what the exploit can allow an attacker to do. A lot of this security information is dual use, right? It's released out there so people can be aware and fix things. But I'm telling you, with IoT devices, it's more likely that attackers are actually using the material than your average homeowner or device owner. So what happens is, and we've seen this just last year with really devastating consequences. This was talked about by the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, CISA, a few times last year, where there were these TP-Link routers made in China, which aren't well supported. They have short lifetimes, and there are plenty of them that are end of life. And it turned out that different Chinese state-sponsored actors were using these devices to hack critical infrastructure. So they were used to hack into electric power plants, into the telephone system, all these things that we rely on for fundamentals for day-to-day life, like electricity and communications, whether it's packets or voice, were compromised. And this was made easier and less detectable, the attacks, because they first went through these home routers. Now, this is where the consumer doesn't really see that there's anything wrong. The router's working fine. It's routing traffic. It just happens to be routing traffic from an attacker somewhere to a piece of critical infrastructure and obfuscating where the attackers are coming from. And it looks like it's
Right.
coming from a home network. And everyone works from home now, right? People who work at phone companies work at home. People who work at power plants work at home. Lots of different IT systems are managed by people working at home. And you have to allow traffic from the Comcasts and the cable modems and different ISPs And so they bank on that access through those devices to make it look like normal behavior. And so what happens is, because the device is working properly, this isn't a problem for the consumer, the end of life device. Oftentimes it's a problem for society and us as a whole. And we're going to talk about this is this is why this is a problem that's hard to solve, and why we're
Right.
talking about this today, and why it wasn't solved 10 years ago when Stacey raised awareness of it, and things are frankly still the same, is because the market is not going to solve this problem. And one of the huge reasons for it is the devices seem to still be working and seem to still be fine, but they are causing harm. They're allowing bad actors to cause harm. And that's one of the things that really bothers me about this whole problem.
Yeah. And it's interesting. We first started really talking about this maybe back in 2015 with the Mirai botnet, right, Chris, which was a botnet made up of broadband routers, smart devices. It was used for some pretty devastating denial of service attacks. But now, 10 years later, there are still IoT botnets, some of them are still being used for denial of service attacks, but they're being used for much more sophisticated types of campaigns, like you said, password spraying attacks, and
Much more
so
stealthy attacks, like the denial of service is you're getting attacked, and your whole thing is, this is an incident. I need to solve this. I need to figure out how to make this stop and route traffic somewhere else. And you can work through it. And sometimes that impacts you for hours, sometimes days. But these stealthy attacks where they're using the vulnerable IoT devices to then get into critical infrastructure in a stealthy way, and they call them implanting in that ICS infrastructure with a way to control it through their botnet. It makes it very difficult to track this down and stop it. So this is where it becomes like a community health or a community environmental problem.
right. And that is one of the kind of key problems here, which is who owns this problem, right? And whose responsibility is it to solve it? That's one of the things that we're going to talk about in this kind of model legislation we put forward. One of the things that we actually try and help resolve. This is a quote from Dan Gear: "Device that's remotely discoverable but locally forgotten is a risk, an avoidable risk. As the number of devices grows, that risk grows. Somebody or something has to keep track," which is speaking to some of the same thing, which is some of the same question, which is who owns this? And Stacey, as you pointed out, consumers might be unaware that their device is end of life as long as it basically does what they purchase it to do, whether that's streaming Netflix or keeping their food cold or warming up their toast. The software version that it's running doesn't really matter to them, right?
And actually, we asked in December, we did a survey, a nationally representative survey of consumers, and we asked them, like, if any of your smart devices has lost software support, how did you first find out? Now, to answer this question, you had to actually be aware that your device lost software support. But 40% of people just said, oh, it stopped working. Only 39% of the people we asked about it actually got any sort of notification from the manufacturer.
Wow.
And a lot of people found out via grandkids or friends or the media. And then others, there were a couple outliers, and people were like, we figured it out because it was acting strange. So for consumers, they will notice because maybe their set-top box is running hot all the time. Maybe if their ISP charges for bandwidth or, has a data charge, maybe they're getting crazy charges and they're, what is happening? A lot of times people will get notifications from their ISP that says, hey, you got something on your network that is behaving terribly. But for the most part, consumers don't know and they don't care. They might care, like I care about polar bears, but they're not going to change. Like, it's very hard to tell a consumer that, oh, just because your video doorbell has stopped getting updates, you should take that offline. I know it looks like it might be working, but now it's no longer secure, so take it offline. And so that's why this is a government kind of problem. And that's why our legislation requires certain things of the manufacturers.
We were talking, I think the broadband router is a great example of that ball dropping between the outfielders problem, right? Because again, a compromised end of life broadband router that still functions for the homeowner Again, as long as you're getting internet access and Netflix, might not be something that strikes them as a problem they need to deal with. For the ISP, this is one device on a network with millions or tens of millions of devices. So not a top priority for us, not necessarily capable of disrupting our network. And then for the manufacturer, of course, listen, we've walked away from this device. We're no longer responsible for it. It's not supported. And so not our problem. But who ultimately could be affected by this? Well, those devices are
We all
corralled.
pay this cost.
And Stacey, as you said, used to attack your local water distributor or take down the electrical grid or something. Suddenly, we're all impacted by that, even though it doesn't fall to any one of us to address the problem. So that is a huge issue. You call it the externality problem, Stacey.
Yes. Yeah. That's what government's good for. Any externality, security is a huge one because we all pay the cost. And it's just I would say it's like herd immunity or vaccines, but that's a little more controversial now. But it's a similar sort of issue.
And I think one of the challenges is at least the federal government in some ways doesn't seem to understand the problem. When we saw the Salt Typhoon and those attacks using the TP-Link router, someone put forth legislation or was arguing that we should just ban TP-Link routers. Like it's coming from China. We can just ban the import of this router. Problem solved. I'm like, okay, there's other routers that also have vulnerabilities. This one just happens to have the most, but there's always a number two, and it's a close number two. It isn't like it's so much better. At the time, I was saying, this is a perfect opportunity to say, let's put some standards in place and say these that don't meet the standards, those are banned. And these that meet the standards are okay, can be managed, and the risk is manageable. Of course, that takes too long. There's too much thinking. So the whole thing just dropped and they never did anything. But the idea that they just wanted to ban one router just shows that people want a quick fix that doesn't really solve the problem.
Or in fault. Yeah, go ahead, Stacey. Sorry.
I was going to say they started the process. So if anyone's interested, and I think it's worth noting that this does exist. So Biden's executive order from, I think, 2021 proposed the US Cyber Trust Mark, and they also proposed a secure router designation. The Cyber Trust Mark is moving along. We can talk about that in a minute. But the secure router effort basically has stopped with NIST. I think it was last year, put out a secure router standard. So that exists. And I will say that CR is very interested in pushing forward with creating standards and building stuff here. So if you're interested in it, come talk to us. But yes, we can and should do more here. But there's a start.
Right. And looking at this through the prism of international relations or our adversarial nations, it misses the bigger picture, which is the software and hardware supply chain for every router maker has roots in China and other countries. So even if you ban TP-Link, that problem doesn't go away. And beyond that, the question isn't where the thing comes from, it's whether it's secure and updated and so on, independent of where it was made. Yes. So that brings us to the big question, right? Which is there a fix for this end of life problem? And in recent months, Stacey and Chris and I and some others, the folks at PERG and the Center for Democracy and Technology, put our heads together and came up with, I would say, a first offering of a solution, a model law for end of life products. And Consumer Reports launched this. So Stacey, I'm going to turn the mic over to you and just ask you to describe the new model legislation for our attendees.
Sure. So we all worked on it together.
We did.
But the idea behind this is one of the most powerful things you can do is inform consumers at the beginning, at the point of purchase, when you expect to stop supporting that product. And we went with what we call a minimum guaranteed time frame for support. And we did that because with connected devices, if they sell well, you see them get supported for a longer period of time. So it's not unusual to see a manufacturer extend those support timeframes. So we didn't want to lock anybody into 5 years and then it's out to the trash. Great. So we're using that framing and we say at the point of purchase, manufacturers should tell consumers their minimum guaranteed support timeframe. And then they should leave that on a product web page that is easily accessible so a consumer can find that. And then when they decide that they are going to stop supporting it, we ask that they give, or the law requires that they would give a 6-month window or a 6-month notification proactively to the consumer that this product is going to lose support. And then once it does lose support, we ask for them to do another proactive notification. And the other element in there is we have a clause for ISPs. For any ISP equipment, so that could be a set-top box, a router, it could actually be home security equipment that Comcast provides. Any of that equipment, the ISP is responsible for tracking that end of life date and then pulling that equipment and replacing it for the consumer. So that's what the law basically offers. And we have shared it. Our hope is that at the state level, because not a lot is happening at the federal level, but we hope to see at the state level some legislators adopt it and introduce it in the next legislative sessions, which wouldn't, they're like in the next winter, fall timeframe, next winter, spring timeframe.
So again, a step forward in terms of getting some transparency and clarity for consumers around when they're buying a smart product of how long is that software support going to last? It puts software support on the radar in some ways, I feel, in a way that it isn't right now when you're buying smart devices. There's no information available to you at the time of purchase. And unless you're technically savvy, it might not be a question you even know enough to ask. And yet it's a super important question.
Yeah.
What are the
I
other
like that
things?
last part.
Right, go ahead. Yeah,
I
go
like
ahead,
that last
Chris.
part because it's just raising awareness of the problem. This isn't going to solve everything. This
Right.
is just disclosure. It's not mandating any specific things except the disclosure part. I guess the ISPs, they need to replace the devices.
They're technically savvy.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it's raising awareness to consumers that this is actually a problem. And this is going to have to be followed on by other things later. So this is just a great start because it raises awareness because people will have to be informed and as part of that transaction, which by far is the best way to talk to consumers, right? Because they can make choices, right? We live in a competitive marketplace. They can make choices among different products to buy. So this is the time where a manufacturer wants to put their best foot forward. And if this is a requirement, they're going to have to do it and do it well.
Absolutely. And again, in some ways, it creates market pressures and market incentives for so if you now have to disclose software support periods, that creates a market incentive, obviously, to have longer support times, or at least distinguishes you from vendors who might have longer support times. We've seen, yeah, go ahead, Stacey.
It also helps with manufacturers, that whole like cost problem with a connected device. It forces them from the beginning to say, okay, if I'm only going to support, it forces them to allocate those costs, think about that ahead of time, which actually could help with like business operations. And so you don't see devices like companies going bankrupt and not having money to support things for that time period.
Yeah, one of the best things in a marketplace solution is to make it competitive. And I know this happened with cars, that everyone used to have a 4-year car warranty, and then it became 5, and then some people did 8, and now there's ones that do 10. And it really is a huge selling point. Like, car companies compete over how long they're going to be maintaining these cars. And the hope here is that if you buy a router and it says support for 2 years, and there's another one that says 5 years, you're going to want the one that says 5 years. And that is incenting the right behavior that will then go and help the whole community because these devices will be more secure.
And I think if we look at the right to repair campaigns of recent years, I think one thing that we can count on is as this legislation gets put forward in state legislatures or even on Capitol Hill, the conversation around these issues starts to come into focus, right? The debates that you're going to have around this legislation, whether to bring it forward out of committee, whether to pass it in a House of Representatives or a state Senate or on Capitol Hill, all of a sudden you start talking about some of the specific issues for and against, and start having conversations around what resolutions for those issues are. But as we sit here now, this is not a topic of conversation, as far as I know. Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
sort of.
Stacey.
I was like, it's actually not too crazy. So it's
Yeah.
already for the US Cyber Trust Mark. It is an element that is part of the US Cyber Trust Mark that manufacturers will have to
End of
disclose their
life.
minimum
Yes.
support
Right.
time.
Right.
So it's also part of international legislation. The UK actually has laws here. The CRA in Europe is going to have some mandates here. So I don't want it to sound like,
Cyber Resilience Act. Yes. Go
sorry,
ahead.
the Cyber Resilience Act.
Yes. That is
Um,
right. Yes.
Yes.
So I don't want it to sound like we're coming out with this crazy idea. This is a really like pretty well established idea that we should be like, let's do it.
I totally agree. Okay. We have a lot of questions to answer, so I want to get to them fairly soon. But and they're great questions. Before I do that, though, the one kind of other issue, which is in the absence of some legislation, which hopefully will pass, but there are things that people can and should do both at the consumer level, so for the smart devices in your home or your small business, as well as the bigger at the kind of at the enterprise level, to assess and address the problem or risk posed by end-of-life devices. So we absolutely want to talk about this model legislation. In the meantime, I thought it'd be worthwhile for our attendees to give them a sense of things that they can do themselves or within their organization. So Stacey, as you said, this federal trust mark that's coming out will and provide a level of information to consumers that it's voluntary, it's not mandatory, it's voluntary, but for vendors who adopt it, it will provide a level of information that has not been there for consumers around software quality and support, right?
Yes. And we should expect to see this. It's taken a really long time. Hopefully, we will see it probably around the beginning to middle of 2026. We'll see products coming out with this label. And if you have this label, it'll have the QR code. You can scan the QR code and you will get access to some security information. You also, if it has that label, it means it has passed a third-party lab test for several cybersecurity
It's great. Yeah.
things. I was like, I'm just going with things there. So that's what the trust mark will be. We'll look for that. It is voluntary, so it's not going to pick up everything. And then because I've lived this life for so long and talked to consumers every day, I will say, when people are like, Stacey, this smart plug is only $5 and this one's $20. Is the $5 one secure? And I'm like, yeah, probably not. But here's what you look for. So I tell consumers that they should, when they're going to buy a smart home product, they should look for reputable brands. So I don't recommend you go for the cheapest device from Amazon, largely because they're not secure. I have people look up the name of the company and brand and see how they handle vulnerabilities. So I usually tell them to Google the brand vulnerability. And what you're looking for is not, do they never have them? It's how they handle them. I tell people that. And then I also, every year, I perform a smart home audit. So in the fall, I use a device called Firewalla in my home, and I can see all of the devices on my network. Eero provides this service. Comcast has an Xfinity service that can show you all the devices. Just go
Maybe
through
throw
and
it
find
into
all
the chat.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
All these devices. And then I physically have to Google and call most of these companies or email their service support lines. And I find out if my product is still supported. And every year I actually have to pull one or two devices off the network because I'm like, oh, apparently sometime in the last year you lost support. So that's
Right.
what you can do.
There is this kind of notion, Chris, of cybersecurity maturity, right? Is a vendor, even if they're a consumer vendor, do they have a vulnerability disclosure program? Do they offer bounties? Do they have a front door for security researchers to come to them with problems? And it's very hard to know that if you're not deep in the weeds on this stuff, but that is relevant for consumer products, just like it is for enterprise products, right?
It definitely is, because if organizations are more accessible to researchers and they have a way to handle vulnerabilities that are reported to them, and they have a whole process for releasing vulnerabilities and documenting them and making them aware to consumers, like the difference between someone who has a program that does all of those things and a manufacturer that's basically caught flat-footed when someone sends them an email saying there's this horrible vulnerability in your product, you should fix it. It could be the difference between something being fixed in weeks to things being fixed in a year or never. So those processes are really important. It's just really hard for a consumer to know. Stacey's suggestion to Google vulnerability handling and the manufacturer's name is a good one, but that's a lot of work for each device, and not everyone can do that. And so that's just a challenge, right? There's an information void here that if there was a standard and you had to do all those things in order to sell your products, that would be great, but we don't like regulations. And it's complex to disclose all that stuff. I think the closest is when you had up there before the software attestation form that CISA has come up with as part of the Biden executive order, but that's really designed for enterprise software that the government is purchasing. It also covers IoT devices that the government is purchasing, but you can imagine that might be different than a lot of the consumer devices. There is some overlap between devices the government buys and consumers, but there's a huge amount of consumer devices that will never be addressed by the government forcing the standard on its suppliers. But the model is good, right? It's like, you're trying to sell me something, show me that it's not going to put my network at undue risk, like it's meeting my expectations for risk management and maintenance going forward. And the enterprises are just catching on to this now in a big way. It's always the government did it, the big banks did it, the huge brands did it, but that left 90% of businesses not doing it. But it is starting to pervade the business world that you really should ask questions about your software supply chain. And really what we're talking about here is disclosures about your IoT device supply chain. Like, where is it coming from? What does that manufacturer say they're going to do?
And of course, no need to say this, but obviously, especially in the post-COVID era, the overlap between consumer home devices and enterprise risk there's a lot of overlap there. Chris, how at the enterprise level, with corporations and industry, is end of life risk a issue that you see them starting to tune into, or something that they're actively managing, or same dynamic, which is, hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it?
Yeah, I think it's largely the same. I think the consequences are bigger in an enterprise environment when something is end of life and you have to transition off of it. Just think of software contracts that run into the millions of dollars and take dozens of people to manage and reconfigure and install. So I think all the problems are there. They're amplified. So the cost goes up. So maybe they're thought about a little bit more. Upgrading different major systems would be more thoughtful in the enterprise. And when you have a contractual relationship, which you typically have in an enterprise, like someone's signing like an agreement, it isn't a shrink wrap, pull it off and now you own it and you agreed to the license. It's negotiable. And you say, hey, how many years am I going to get of maintenance? And when it goes up, when it's not free anymore, how much is it going to cost? So there's already a lot more disclosure and in the enterprise environment that you can plan around that you don't get in the consumer environment, that you're left on.
And if you're a big company, then you've got even more leverage in that conversation and more power to dictate the way things play out. Okay, let's get to some of these questions. We've got a fair number of them, and they're great questions. I'll start with Michael Meyer, who asked the first question. So it's almost more of a comment: CVEs, SBOMs, IT versus OT, cyber, supply chain issues, DevSecOps framework, OWASP, SAM. It's easy to update. IT is easy to update, but OT is difficult because there's no change management in place. Some thoughts on the IT versus OT issue here, and IoT kind of has.
I think the thing is when it's OT, which is operational technology, it's doing something, right? It's running, it's pumping water, it's closing a gate, it's doing something. And so it isn't, hey, at 2 a.m. when almost no one's using it, we're just going to turn it off and we're gonna upgrade it or update it. So when you have OT, everything has to be planned. You have to have a plan for doing these updates What are you going to do while you're doing the update? And you might need that thing. So you might need a backup. You might need redundancy. And so all this planning has to come in with OT, which means there's just more friction with OT updates than IT updates. So it's less likely that OT devices are going to get updated unless it was planned for. And part of the problem is some of these devices are relatively old. It was built 15 years ago. It has a PC in it. It's running Windows, but it wasn't, it was the people who built the system didn't plan for this. So now
Right.
you got to do all this work around updating. So
Okay.
it
Yeah.
just makes things harder.
I was just going to say the things like the Purdue model of security for OT systems, they don't make sense anymore. What's happening is like this change in how these things are built and engineered to be more responsive to the types of attacks of being connected to the internet. But broadly speaking, like it's going to be a nightmare. But a lot of the OT hacks, or the quote unquote OT hacks that we've seen, are not actually OT hacks. They're IT hacks that result in the OT networks being shut down. And the easiest ways to solve them, there's so much low hanging fruit just by adding MFA. So, like, I know that people love to freak out about OT, but a lot of the OT issues are really IT issues.
Yeah, OT is hard to hack because the devices are rare and expensive and attackers don't have direct access to them. Where if it's like what we saw at that water plant in Florida, it was like remote access software that like is running on all kinds of office desktops and there's a free trial version. So yeah, I mean, IT stuff is easier to hack because it's more accessible.
Okay, next question. This one's from Alan. What are some pieces of the puzzle that we can collectively work through? Do we need common definitions of what security support is? Easy to discover metadata to identify end of life software, infrastructure to share that end of life data? Excellent questions. I would say yes and yes, but interested, Stacey and Chris, in your thoughts.
I'll go ahead because we in our legislation actually, this was a topic of debate because end of life, end of support, end of sale, they all are used differently by different vendors. So we actually went with just two definitions: end of life, which, so one, we need like a common nomenclature across the consumer board because otherwise it's terrible. And we chose in our legislation end of life and end of sale. And that is, end of life is the point where the manufacturer ceases to provide any sort of software updates, any security functions, everything, even if it's still in use. End of sale is when a manufacturer should stop selling the product. We in our legislation said you should do it at least a year before end of life because we commonly see, I actually can find an end of life connected home devices right now on Amazon. That's a third party marketplace
Yeah.
issue, but it sucks. And then there's this idea of metadata. One of the things with the cyber label, which is really exciting, is that they want to have a programmatic access to an API that has all this information. So the big thinking, and this is actually happening like with the CSA, which is the organization promoting Matter in the smart home, they're trying to work towards a future where you will have your router or your home firewall software, whatever you have, will programmatically pull that information, keep it consistent, and then let you know or automatically quarantine devices off the network when end of life is reached. Basically, broadly, you're just going to see enterprise solutions make their way down to the consumer because we're having similar, like, have a lot of tech in our house and it's a weak point.
Mhm.
It is interesting. Like people are like, oh, I built the consumer version of the software and then I built the enterprise version, which had all this extra functionality to hook into reporting systems and authentication systems and management systems. And we're ending up needing that in our homes because we need to manage and report on so many devices now. It's like we all have a little mini enterprise
Right.
in our homes.
That's right. And I do feel like we need a new kind of era of regulations and lawmaking that make some of this process more clear and defined and predictable for companies, which is really what companies want. They want predictable rules that they can abide by. And if you think back half a century ago or a century ago, how many regulations were passed. It said, if you're doing this, you need to take out an advertisement in the newspaper that says this is what you will be doing so that the public is informed and so on. A lot of those laws have outlived their usefulness. But you can imagine something like that around smart devices of saying, if you're you're a manufacturer and you're declaring something dead, you need to take these steps to make sure that the public is aware of what you are doing and that your customers out there, right? And whether that is having some way of ensuring communication with your customer or just making sure they come across this information and are informed. Those are all things that can be worked out. But it's all about providing structure and guidelines. So really good question.
Which the government can uniquely do. There are I don't know if the IETF or some of these other standards bodies would want to wade into this, but having a database of metadata with end of life information that people who make routers could hook into.
That's right.
Or people who want to make scanners or whatever. Or you could, if you found a device on your network, you could just go to a website and see information about it. It would be hugely useful, but I'm not sure where that's going to happen.
Okay. Alan has another really good question. It's a short one, but a really interesting one, which is how should we think about end of life for open source? This is that is a really good question. Is something that hasn't been updated in 3 years end of life, or how do we deal with this?
So there are products starting, and these are enterprise grade products for people who are doing software development at enterprise scale, who are using a lot of open source. They want to de-risk using that open source. So they'd rather use a well-maintained package that looks like it will last the lifetime or be maintained the lifetime of the product that you're building. And so people have been gathering metrics around different open source projects and actually different open source developers and contributors and maintainers to try to come up with metrics that say, oh, this project is well maintained, this project is not well maintained. And then the extreme, this is a malicious project. Like this is trying to typo squat on something and it has malware in it, because that's starting to happen now too. So there's a lot of challenges with open source. And one of them is it dies silently, right? It just doesn't get maintained anymore. And how does someone who's dependent on that open source package get information to say, at this point in time, I set my knobs to say, like, when it goes past this threshold of not being maintained, I want to be notified. And that's really just emerging right now. It's a great thing that we can discuss, and IoT should hook into that for sure. You're on mute, Paul.
Go. Do one more question and then we can answer some of these other ones offline. Let me just see. Checo has a question. What is a reasonable time for end of life in technology? Does end of life mean purchasing obsolescence or non-supported? Automobile manufacturers are required to have parts available for 20 years after end of life. Really good question. What are our thoughts on what we mean by what definition goes around end of life? Should it just be up to the manufacturer to decide, or should there be some standard definition of this?
I don't think you can treat software the same way you treat parts. I think that's part of the problem here, right? So end of life for a connected product means that the manufacturer is no longer supporting security updates. Maybe it's cloud updates. They're definitely not updating the apps. So this encompasses both security and also eventually functionality of the thing. Now, in our legislation, we just call it reasonable. And Consumer Reports has got data on smart home products on how long people expect their smart home devices to receive support. It's actually really interesting data because it's very much a bell curve, and it speaks to the confusion that people have about what they think will happen with their devices when they stop getting support. A lot of people think it will still work. The secondary part of this, though, is there's still a physical device that still could perform functions, even if it doesn't have the software or the cloud connection. And so we're seeing, and we actually have proposed to the FTC that they should have things like open source, like maybe the manufacturer should open source their code, and then things like OpenWRT or the Rebel Alliance, like those kind of organizations can keep it going. There's also folks who believe that a product should work as a basic version of itself when offline. So your car should still drive, etc. Your oven should still heat. That becomes a little bit more challenging as we enter into this era of AI products, right? Like you see with the Humane Pin, it is virtually useless without a connection. So
Right.
it's a really hard problem to solve, but those are some of the ideas out there as to how to think about it and solve it.
Okay. So we're at time here, and there are a few more questions. We will get answers out to those questions via just posts, email. And thank you for asking them. Before we go, I wanted to just make the final point, which is SRFF, Secure Resilient Future Foundation, is doing events like this because we're looking for support. We're looking for you to join. And if you're in a mood to make contributions to help us bring this movement forward. And that could be, hey, I live in this state. I'm interested in being involved. If you guys want to try and bring that legislation to bear in my state, I'm here and I can help you do that. I can help you advocate for it, show up and testify if need be, and so on. So there's that level. And then there's also, of course, if you want to contribute to the cause. And we've got a link here for fundraising particularly for promoting this model legislation. As this all takes resources, but this is a really important cause, and it's something that I think as a cybersecurity community, we got to get behind and work collectively on, and that's what we're all about. So I'll just end on that note. And if you have any questions, you can reach me at paul@secure-resilient.org. You can check out our website. And I just wanted to take the final minute to just say thank you so much to our panelists, Stacey and Chris, for taking the time to come in and talk to us. Really great presentation, some really great engagement questions. And I think this has been super helpful. Thank you both so much.
And thank you too, Paul. Thanks for hosting.
Yeah. Thanks for making this happen.
No problem. And yeah, again, if this is stuff that's interesting to you, check out our website. Check out Consumer Reports as well. There's a grassroots movement going to try and get smarter laws in place. And it's a great time to get involved in that if it's something that interests you.